We will start with Anna Fisher. She is a co-founder of Nordic Model Now, and she will be speaking about British culture, the British establishment, and the grooming gangs scandal. So over to you, Anna, and thank you very much for being here with us.
While we share the widespread horror at the treatment of the girls in these scandals, we're concerned at the very narrow focus of much of the debate, public debate, in particular, the idea that this is a completely alien behavior that was brought to this country by immigrants from Pakistan, a country with a terrible record on women's rights, and that it was a fear of being branded racist that was the major factor that led to the police and other authorities turning a blind eye. While there may be elements of truth in some of these assertions, they detract from factors intrinsic to British culture and the institutional failings that made what happened practically inevitable. They also deflect serious consideration about how to prevent something similar happening again. We fear that any public inquiry instigated in the current climate amid the public calls for vengeance would be unlikely to bring about the change that is so urgently needed. It's seldom possible to understand a deep-rooted social problem without understanding its history. There are many strands to these scandals, including the unique nature of many of the communities of people of Pakistani descent in the north of England. I draw on Finding a Voice, Asian Women in Britain by Amrit Wilson about some of this history, and later on I will draw from Homebreakers to Jailbreakers by Rahila Gupta of Southall Black Sisters. Most of these communities have their roots in the large wave of migration to the UK from Pakistan after the Second World War, peaking in the late 1960s. They mostly came from rural areas of Pakistani Punjab and Azad Kashmir, where they lived in tight-knit villages with an almost feudal economy and strict patriarchal social structures. This is a recent photo of Azad Kashmir, so not representative of what it would have looked like in the 50s and 60s, but it gives a sense of the terrain. While women were at the bottom of the pile, they were surrounded by women of multiple generations, which provided solace and support, and sometimes a counterbalance to the collective power of the men. The men responded to calls to help rebuild the British economy after the Second World War and found work in textile mills in Lancashire and Yorkshire, engineering industries in the Midlands, and light industry further south. Typically, the men would come first and only send for their families once they were established, sometimes years later. When their wives arrived, they typically lived in poor accommodation in rundown areas. Unlike their husbands, who learned English at work, the women couldn't speak English, and as they mostly stayed at home, had little opportunity to learn it, and they often became very isolated. This was in stark and painful contrast to their lives back home, where they lived in multi-generational extended families, contributed to work on the family farms, and often had freedom to move around their villages where everyone was kin. Meanwhile, the social changes of the swinging 60s were forging ahead in Britain, with women adopting skinny tops, mini skirts, and hot pants, and racism was rampant, all of which would have tended to make these migrant communities who valued modesty turn inwards. The police widely tolerated prostitution in the rundown areas where these families typically lived, and along with racism, sexism prevailed. The Yorkshire police spent the entire 1970s failing to catch the prolific serial murderer of women known as the Yorkshire Ripper, mainly because they failed to listen to all the women who had near misses with him and gave accurate descriptions that the police then ignored. But before I go any further, I want to read some testimony from Arlene, a member of Nordic Model Now. This is how she described what happened to her in a Midlands community in the 1980s. I have her permission to share this with you. I quote, "I met my pimp when I was 13. He was 18 and a well-known local drug dealer. I voluntarily had sex with him once or twice, but then he started forcing me to have sex with his friends and other men. I resisted, but there was no escape. They were bigger and stronger than me. My pimp would punch and manhandle me, and collectively they'd block the path that was my only route home from school. So I had no choice but to acquiesce. After that, almost every school day for more than 3 years, and some days in the holidays, between 5 and 10 men would have sex with me and pay my pimp. They were mostly adult men who had flats and houses, cars and wives and kids. Occasionally boys from school would join in, but mostly it was adult men from the local estates and sometimes from further afield, some coming in groups. Most of them were white, as was my pimp. I felt they enjoyed being able to treat me, a young girl, in incredibly inhumane ways. I had the sense they'd been waiting to do this for their whole lives. Sometimes, obviously, they felt guilty and they would try to sweet talk me. But this was usually when they were one-on-one with me. They were all, 'You're so beautiful,' etc., until it was done. And then they'd laugh with my pimp about what an ugly slag I was. Even though I knew they were lying when they complimented me, it still hurt. The group sex was the worst. This was usually the norm. The men all being verbally and often physically abusive together. It was like a pack mentality. They would want to copy what they'd seen in porn. This added to the danger I was in, as what one man did, the others followed. Over the years, this led to me being spat at by every man there, strangled until almost unconscious, and the men forcing or attempting to force various items, such as bottles and sticks picked up from the ground, into my vagina or anus. They seemed to think it funny to try to make me cry, which I never did. My pimp would attempt to force his fist into my vagina as a punishment for doing anything that displeased him. The spitting thing happened like this. I was on my knees giving one guy a blowjob, and one of the guys watching spat on me. Then the guy getting the blowjob laughed and did it too. And then they all took turns to do it. This kind of thing was very common. It was just bearable with the spitting, but when it was the strangling or the cider bottle they picked up off the ground, that was when things started to get really scary. I'd just sort of tune out. I was terrified of being caught, of all the trouble I'd be in, and all the questioning and shaming that would ensue, especially the public shaming. Shame was the biggest thing. I was scared of the guys, especially when they were violent, but the way they spoke to me and treated me like utter filth that they hated and mocked, filled me with shame so deeply that I carry it now. Altogether, it must have been about 5,000 men who raped me over those years. That's equivalent to about 3% of the adult male population of the town. And that was just me. Something similar was almost certainly happening to other girls and young women in the area." End quote. What Arlene endured at the hands of mostly white British men in the 1980s was not significantly different from what the girls exploited by the so-called grooming gangs also suffered. She says that everyone knew what was going on, almost certainly including the local police, but no one tried to stop it or to help her. Colloquially, she was the slapper who deserved everything that came to her. What happened to Arlene and many other women in the Nordic Model Now group was, and still is, British culture, condoned by the British state, a culture in which until very recently, domestic abuse was considered a private matter. Rape in marriage was not a crime until 1991. A culture in which violent, misogynistic and racist online porn consumption is rampant, but practically never acknowledged or talked about. Even though the law has now changed in some areas, attitudes are slow to change, and women are still a long way from having practical equality. There are still widespread attitudes in the police that dealing with rape, domestic abuse, prostitution, and child abuse is not proper police work. Given all this, why should we be surprised that Pakistani men would also frequent prostitution, given its official tolerance in the UK and the patriarchal attitudes in their own culture? And later, as deindustrialization accelerated from the 1980s onwards, and many of the men lost regular livelihoods, why would we be surprised at their turn to pimping girls and young women and exploiting their prostitution and handing them around to rape like trophies, when this is what they saw British men doing with pretty much impunity, particularly given the context of Western-made porn eroticizing and normalizing this behavior, and this meshed so well with the low status of women in their own culture. There will always be people who push at boundaries to see how far they can go. Is that not why we have a criminal code? To make it clear that some behavior is beyond the pale and you go there at the risk of sanctions that can be severe. That's the theory anyway. The trouble is, when the law is not enforced, it doesn't work like that. The British state has long allowed the brutal sexploitation of mostly working class girls and women to thrive, and legislation against the perpetrators to go largely unenforced. So surely the British state has the biggest culpability here, because this did happen in full view of the state. The Pakistani gangs, but also the entire burgeoning sexploitation industry and the vicious exploitation of Arlene's prostitution in the 1980s and of so many other women and girls. In the 1980s, to all of this was added multiculturalism. On the surface, it sounds like an excellent thing, that we all want tolerance, mutual respect, and the valuing of all our unique cultures, except that's not how the policy works in practice. Rahila Gupta of Southall Black Sisters explains it like this, I quote, "At its best, multiculturalism is a laudable attempt to promote racial tolerance and respect for cultural diversity. At its worst, it challenges neither the structural basis of racism nor inequality. It bypasses the need for local democracy because it relies on self-appointed community leaders who have no interest in social justice or women's equality. The problem lies not merely with the multicultural approach, but with the way in which the notion of community is constructed. Through the politics of multiculturalism, the state more or less enters into an informal contract with the more powerful leaders in the minority community. In practice, community leaders maintain power over family, cultural, and religious affairs of the community, with the effect of concealing power relations between men and women and legitimizing women's subordination." End quote. Now, consider how this concept was grafted onto a police culture that was already considered male violence against women and girls, including their brutal exploitation and prostitution, to be not real police work, and possibly something that the women and girls intrinsically deserve, and that dealt with challenges and wrongdoing by closing ranks and turning a blind eye. The community leaders in these Pakistani communities were invariably male religious leaders. Along with multiculturalism came multi-agency projects, which would give centrality to the community leaders while excluding more radical voices. The end result was often the ever further marginalization and disempowerment of women, while the community leaders will become part of the local hierarchies. So once the sexploitation of girls by men in these tight-knit Pakistani communities in northern cities and towns in particular started to become obvious, the reaction would have been similar to what would likely have happened if it came to light that the sons of powerful white men in the police or local Rotary Club were running a prostitution ring. Or indeed, if it were a powerful white man like Cyril Smith. No one would want to upset the chief constable or the local imam they'd been sitting next to in multi-agency meetings for years. And anyway, it was only working class girls who only had themselves to blame. So everyone would close ranks and not only ignore the problem, but also do everything in their power to cover it up. Anyone who didn't comply with this was obviously too emotionally involved and would be rigorously sidelined. Once they'd done that, no matter what further evidence came to light, they'd have to continue the cover-up because otherwise they'd expose their own complicity. This is how hierarchical social organizations work. In retrospect, years later, they might say that it was because they didn't want to be accused of racism, but this is an oversimplification. To explain it as not wanting to be accused of racism sounds so much better than saying they were just a cowardly pawn who didn't give a fig what men do to children. It also conveniently displaces the blame onto overzealous anti-racism campaigners and promoters of political correctness gone mad. When the situation becomes too big to ignore, what usually happens is that one or two concessions are made, which are presented as solutions to the problem, but that often bring about little improvement or might even make the situation worse. One example of this was the removal of all references to child prostitution from the English criminal law in 2015, and its replacement with the term child sexual exploitation, or CSE. This was in response to a campaign that used the tagline, "No such thing as a child prostitute." The idea was that if we changed the terminology, people would stop writing the girls off as prostitutes and would stop saying it was a lifestyle choice. But of course, changing attitudes and practices is much harder than changing terminology. There have been many unintended consequences of this. It implies that adult prostitution is a lifestyle choice, which we vehemently dispute. It also obscures the fact that the perpetrators sold girls to other men to sexually use and abuse for money, power, status, or some other tangible or intangible benefit. In other words, the motivation was not just their own warped self-gratification, but also financial or other gain, the exact same motivation of pimps who exploit adult women's prostitution. Recognizing this does not mean that we have to call the girls prostitutes or to incorrectly suggest their involvement is a lifestyle choice. But not recognizing the financial motivations of the perpetrators means that we're ignoring an important aspect of what is involved. The girls are not just sexually abused, they're also treated as commodities, as objects, as non-persons that can be bought and sold for another person's benefit. This is human trafficking under international law, regardless whether they were transported from place to place. Like Arlene, they were often raped by multiple men in a single day, often day after day after day. Treating the exploitation of children's prostitution as a fundamentally different phenomenon from adult prostitution means no one needs to think how the two are connected. So instead of seeing a massive interconnected problem linked by men's demand to sexually use and abuse women and girls and the money that can be made from that, we get something like this. Some small problems that are not connected in any way and that don't require challenging men's demand. This means that nothing fundamental has to change. The police can continue to partner with the big pimping websites and to not enforce the law on pimping and brothel keeping. The government can continue to include prostitution in GDP, and no one needs to think twice when the government invests in Killing Kittens, a company that runs sex parties, or what are more accurately described as pop-up brothels. Yes, all these things are true and happening here in the UK right now. Of course, when paying the sex acts with an adult is considered acceptable, it is going to lower the inhibition to paying for sex with a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old. And what the hell, that 14-year-old is already well developed, so why not her too? It also obscures what is happening in these so-called grooming gangs. It is no accident that in the Oxford case, which came to court before the legislation was changed, there was clear recognition that commercial gain was a key motivation. For example, here is paragraph 21 from the judge's sentencing remarks. I quote, "Quite apart from using her for your own sexual self-gratification, you coerced her into providing sex to vast numbers of strangers. Up to 4 or 5 men would be invited to addresses so they could have sex with her. Men were brought from Bradford, Leeds, Slough and London. Men would say they had come a long way to see her. AB describes you and the other men who would come as having a pack mentality. You were oblivious as to what was happening to her. Your only concerns were your own self-gratification and the satisfaction of your customers, so you could achieve commercial gain. If she resisted, she would be coerced. Customers would become angry." End quote. The fact that the girls were being exploited in prostitution was picked up at the time by the press, which reported that one girl was sold for £600 an hour. Since the terminology in the legislation was changed to CSE, there has been much less acknowledgement, if any, of this aspect of these cases. Even the otherwise excellent Telford inquiry seemed devoid of awareness of the connections between adult and child prostitution and men's demand for both. It is as if the change in terminology has made people feel that it is somehow improper to acknowledge the reality of the exploitation of children's prostitution and its connections with adult prostitution. Sadly, it seems there is no equivalent inhibition in blaming the girls. There are other examples of how the practice of multiculturalism and consequent pandering to self-appointed male leaders have been discriminatory against women. For example, a law was introduced in 2002 giving courts the power to refuse to grant a divorce if a religious marriage has not already been dissolved. This has been a disaster for women in Muslim and Orthodox Jewish communities, where only men have the power to grant religious divorces. As a result, the British state enables and endorses religious men, preventing their wives escaping abusive marriages. Another example is that during the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement negotiations, the British government succumbed to demands from male leaders of both Catholic and Protestant communities to not extend the Abortion Act 1967 to Northern Ireland as a condition of continuing the negotiations. In this way, the British government violated its obligations under international law to the women in Northern Ireland at the behest of male political leaders on both sides. Another little-known aspect of the current epidemic of sexual abuse of children in the UK is our age of consent laws. Most people assume that the age of consent is 16, and any sexual activity with a child younger than that automatically counts as statutory rape, or the equivalent for other child sexual offences. In fact, this only applies if the child is 12 or younger. You heard that right, 12. If the child is 13 or over, the defendant can claim that he thought she was 16, 18 in CSE offences, and it is up to the prosecution to prove that this is not true. This is a get out of jail free card for men, allowing them to say, "I thought she was 16, Your Honour, honest." It is often simply impossible to prove that wasn't the case. In addition, the CPS guidance on consent includes a long section on consent in CSE cases, even though consent is not relevant to these cases. This complicates the prosecution of child sexual offences and is likely a reason that successful prosecutions make up such a tiny proportion of the reported cases. It is beyond time that the law was changed to move the burden of proof in all child sexual offences from the prosecution to the defendant, or even better, to make them strict liability offences. Another issue is that the Modern Slavery Act 2015, the human trafficking legislation in England and Wales, does not conform to binding obligations under international law, particularly as it relates to sex trafficking, which disproportionately affects women and girls. More or less all of the girls exploited in the grooming gang scandals meet the international definition of sex trafficking victims, but not under the definition in the Modern Slavery Act. This and policy based on similar rationale means that latest figures show that in the UK, approximately 3 times as many labour trafficking victims, who are mainly male, are recognised than sex trafficking victims, who are almost exclusively female. If you include criminal exploitation with the labour exploitation, the disparity is even more shocking, as this slide shows. This is skewing the European and even the global statistics, so that it seems that labour trafficking is a bigger problem than sex trafficking. This is extremely unlikely to be true, if only because sex trafficking is obscenely profitable and comes with very little risk, in the UK at least. For example, recent research found pimps and traffickers in the UK can make £20,000 per month per woman or girl, meaning it is many, many times more profitable than labour trafficking. So while we may think that we live in a modern democracy in which women have equal rights as men, the reality is actually far removed from this. Our modern legislation has been grafted onto an establishment and systems that evolved over centuries before women even got the vote. This is demonstrated in our age of consent laws that date back to the 1880s, and the patriarchal nature and values of most of our public institutions, including the police and local councils. Added to which we've had decades of lobbying by well-funded pressure groups for the expansion of the sex industry. We believe that it was their lobbying that resulted in our shockingly sexist Modern Slavery Act, and that led in 2019 to Boris Johnson shelving the excellent age verification legislation that had already been passed. We do not believe that the grooming gang scandals can be fully understood without understanding the limitations in the law and the dynamics that I have touched on. With the culture in the police and local authorities and other powerful institutions remain dominated by rigid hierarchies that value loyalty to the hierarchy, to those at the top, and to men's sex rights. Above all else, I fear we are likely to see many more such scandals. We need to change this. We need to change the narrative and the culture. We need to end men's impunity to rape and torture women and children. We need to say no to men, no to men's impunity. We need to say no to men buying sex acts under any circumstances, whether that's online on OnlyFans and the webcamming rooms or in real life. That's what the Nordic model is about. It's about making men understand that they cannot continue in the same way. Men are not babies and they need to begin to act like adults, just as women are always required to do. We need all women to stand together and insist on this. We need to insist on the full enforcement of the law against all third parties profiting from another person's prostitution, regardless of their age or sex. We need to insist that the government updates the Modern Slavery Act so its definition of human trafficking conforms to the international definition. This would mean that the sex trafficking legislation could replace the current CSE legislation. And instead of calling it CSE, everyone could call it sex trafficking, as it is correctly termed in the US. This would make it much easier to successfully prosecute. But before you jump off a cliff in despair, I want to remind you of the words of Alice Walker. Resistance is the secret of joy. Women, we must come together in resistance. Thank you, and please follow Nordic Model now on social media and check out our website.